Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift back in time, not just to witness a moment in history, but to watch it break, to see it splinter into a new, unfamiliar stream. Picture the stony chill of a cathedral, not in London, but in Paris. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass, dapples across a floor worn smooth by centuries of French kings. But the man kneeling before the high altar, the man about to be anointed with holy oil, is English. His name is Henry, and on his banners, the golden leopards of England are quartered with the golden lilies of France. The Channel, that historic moat, is no longer a barrier. It is a royal river, flowing through the heart of a single sprawling kingdom. The sheer, breathtaking ambition of it all, to weld two such ancient and proud rivals into one crown, is a concept that would redefine the destiny of Europe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in this world, this alternate 15th century. The year is, let's say, 1475. For 2 generations now, there has been no King of France in the way you'd understand it. There is only the King of England and France. The civil war that we know as the Wars of the Roses. It never happened. Not in the same way, with the vast lands and resources of the French kingdom to reward loyal nobles and punish dissenters. The dynastic squabbles of the English aristocracy were snuffed out before they could truly ignite. The power of the crown, bloated with French wealth and prestige, became almost absolute. The great English lords, the Nevilles, the Beauforts, the Mortimers, are no longer just Earls of Warwick or Somerset. They are now also the Dukes of Normandy, the Counts of Anjou, their sons granted vast estates in the Loire Valley or Gascony. They are becoming a new kind of nobility, a bilingual cross-channel elite, as comfortable in a Parisian palace as they are in a drafty English castle. The language of the royal court, held for half the year in Paris and the other half split between London and Windsor, is a curious hybrid. It's a formal, Latinized French for law and diplomacy, but a practical, rapidly evolving Middle English, now peppered with French idioms for military command and daily administration. For the common man in Kent or Yorkshire, not much seems different, except that the taxes are higher, and the king is away a lot. But for the merchant in Bordeaux, or the artisan in Rouen, the change is everywhere. English soldiers, les goddams, as they were once cursed, are now the permanent city garrison. English merchants have preferential access to the wine trade, their ships clogging the Gironde estuary. Royal decrees are posted in both languages, a constant reminder of who is in charge. This is the reality of the Dual Monarchy, a political entity born from the crucible of the longest and most devastating war in European history. The legal foundation for this extraordinary state of affairs is a document that, in our timeline, was a temporary triumph for the English, but in this one became permanent scripture. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, was the masterstroke of King Henry V. It didn't just name him as regent and heir to the French throne, it explicitly disinherited the Dauphin, Charles, the son of the current French king. It was a legal manoeuvre of breathtaking audacity, essentially declaring the legitimate bloodline of France null and void. In our world, this treaty fell apart within a decade. But here it held. It became the bedrock of a new Anglo-French state, and its legacy is etched into every coin, which shows two crowned heads side by side, Henry of England and his French queen, Catherine of Valois, the very woman whose bloodline was used to legitimise the conquest of her own people. The logistic of managing this sprawling bicultural kingdom are a nightmare, a constant source of anxiety for the royal council. Historians in this timeline endlessly debate whether the dual monarchy was a true union or simply an English occupation with a gilded French face. Was it a partnership or a conquest masquerading as one? The truth, as always, is messier. The king's court is perpetually on the move. Imagine the sheer spectacle. A procession miles long of wagons, soldiers, clerks, priests and nobles trundling from Paris down to the coast to board a fleet of ships for the crossing to Dover, then on to London. The Channel is a constant shuttle of royal authority. This has a strange side effect. The sea itself has been transformed. The Straits of Dover are no longer a perilous frontier, but a well-policed highway, with royal fleets suppressing piracy with a brutality born of necessity. It's arguably the safest stretch of water in the world, essential for holding the two halves of the kingdom together. And in Paris, the symbol of this new order is the Bastille. In our history, it was a royal fortress and infamous prison. In this world, its role is magnified. It's the headquarters of the English military administration in France. Its towers thickened, its garrison doubled. It looms over the city not just as a symbol of royal power, but of English power. It's from here that the English Constable of France governs the occupied territories, collects the punitive taxes, and ensures the French nobility, those who bent the knee, remain loyal. A quirky, humanising tidbit from this reality is the birth of a whole new genre of French puppet shows and satirical plays, performed in secret, where the villain is always a caricature of an Englishman, an Anglais with an exaggerated accent, an obsession with roast beef, and a comically misplaced sense of superiority. It's a small, quiet rebellion, the only kind left. So how did we get here? How did the dream of English kings, a claim stretching back to William the Conqueror and solidified by Henry II, finally become a reality? It wasn't a single battle or one brilliant king. It was the result of a century of grinding, attritional warfare that hollowed out France, and a series of catastrophic political blunders by the French themselves. To understand how the English lion finally devoured the French fleur-de-lis, you have to go back, not to the fields of Agincourt or Crécy, but further back to the tangled family trees and legal arguments that lit the fuse on a conflict that would burn for over 100 years. It was a war sparked not by a lust for conquest, initially, but by a legitimate, if audacious, claim to the throne of France itself. A claim rooted in blood, marriage, and a single fateful legal loophole. This whole colossal, century-spanning conflict, this venture that would end with an English king on the French throne, didn't begin with an army boarding ships at Dover. It began in a quiet, anxious room with a dying king. It began with a family tree. You see, to understand the legitimacy or the stunning arrogance, depending on your perspective, of the English claim, you have to wind the clock back to 1328. The King of France, Charles IV, lay on his deathbed, and he had a problem that plagued monarchs throughout history. He had no son. With his death, the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty, a line of kings that had ruled France uninterrupted for over 300 years, was extinguished. It was a political crisis of the highest order. Suddenly, the question of succession wasn't theoretical. It was urgent. Two main candidates emerged from the tangled web of royal bloodlines. The first was Philip of Valois, a French nobleman, a cousin to the late king. His claim was solid, respectable, and, most importantly, it was entirely French. The second candidate was a teenager across the water, King Edward III of England. His claim was more direct, yet far more problematic. His mother was Isabella of France, the late King Charles's own sister. By blood, Edward was Charles's nephew. Philip was merely his cousin. On paper, the nephew's claim seems stronger than the cousin's, doesn't it? But there was a catch. A legal ghost resurrected from the Dark Ages, specifically for this moment, Salic law. Now, this is the legal linchpin of the whole war. The established historical fact you need to grasp is that Salic law, an ancient code of the Salian Franks, had originally dealt with things like inheritance of private lands, not royal succession. One of its clauses stated that land could not be inherited by a woman. In 1328, the French nobility, faced with the deeply unappealing prospect of their kingdom passing to an English monarch, dusted off this old text. They argued that if a woman couldn't inherit the throne herself, then she also couldn't transmit the right to inherit the throne to her son. The crown, they declared, could not pass through the female line. It was a brilliant, if self-serving, legal manoeuvre. It neatly disqualified Edward III and paved the path for Philip of Valois to be crowned King Philip VI. And so the House of Valois began its rule of France. There's a great deal of scholarly debate on whether this invocation of Salic law was a genuine legal precedent or simply a political improvisation, a post hoc justification to keep the English out. Most historians lean towards the latter. It was a choice born of nascent nationalism. The French lords looked at Philip, one of their own, and then at Edward, an English king whose formidable mother, Isabella, known as the She-Wolf of France, had recently helped depose and likely murder her own husband in England. They chose the man they knew, the culture they shared. They chose France for the French. Edward, a young king still finding his footing, was forced to acquiesce. For a time, he even paid homage to Philip VI for his continental territory, the Duchy of Gascony, a large and wealthy slice of southwestern France that had been an English possession since the days of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. This homage was a constant source of humiliation. Imagine being a king, sovereign in your own realm, yet having to kneel before another king and pledge fealty for a piece of your own domain. Here's a quirky, humanising tidbit. The exact nature of this homage was a diplomatic nightmare. There was simple homage, a basic recognition of lordship. And then there was liege homage, a much more binding oath that obligated you to fight for your lord, even against your own interests. Edward and Philip's courts haggled endlessly over the specific rituals and words, a passive-aggressive ballet of power that underscored the fundamental instability of the situation. Edward felt cheated of a crown. Philip felt perpetually insecure with such a powerful vassal. The fragile peace couldn't last. Two kingdoms were like tectonic plates grinding against each other. France began actively supporting Scotland in its wars against England, a policy that would become known as the Old Alliance and a thorn in England's side for centuries. Philip VI seeking to consolidate his power, also began interfering more and more in Gascony, harassing English officials and threatening to confiscate the duchy altogether. For Edward, this was the final provocation. Gascony was not just a piece of land, its wine trade was a massive source of income for the English crown. Losing it was unthinkable. So, in 1337, when Philip VI did officially declare Gascony forfeit, Edward III responded with the political equivalent of a nuclear bomb. He dropped his grudging acceptance of Philip's reign and formally revived his claim to the French throne. He declared himself the rightful King of France. This wasn't just a squabble over territory anymore. Edward had escalated it into a war over the very identity and sovereignty of France itself. He created a new royal coat of arms, quartering the golden leopards of England with the blue and gold fleurs-de-lis of France, a powerful piece of visual propaganda that declared his ambition to the world. The 100 Years' War had begun. What's crucial to understand is that from the English perspective, this wasn't initially a war of foreign conquest. It was, in their view, a dynastic dispute, a civil war for the French crown. They saw the Valois as usurpers and themselves as the legitimate claimants fighting to reclaim their inheritance. This belief, this conviction of righteousness, is what fueled their incredible perseverance for the next century. It's what justified the immense cost in blood and treasure, and it's what made the eventual prospect of a total victory, of uniting the two crowns, seem not like a wild fantasy, but like the restoration of the proper order of things. This deeply rooted legal claim, however debatable, was the seed from which a new two-headed kingdom would eventually, in our alternate timeline, grow. It set the stage for a century of devastation, a brutal, grinding process of war that would leave France a shadow of its former self, ripe for the taking. So the die is cast. Edward III has declared himself King of France, and the two greatest kingdoms in Christendom are locked into a conflict that will outlive everyone who saw it begin. But what we call the 100 Years' War wasn't a constant, unceasing state of total war. That would have been impossible. It was instead a series of savage, intermittent campaigns punctuated by long, bankrupt truces and simmering hostility. It was a rhythm of destruction. For the people on the ground, particularly in France, it was a living nightmare, a plague of soldiers that descended without warning and receded just as mysteriously, leaving famine and ruin in their wake. The early phases of the war were defined by a stunning English military innovation. The longbow? This wasn't just a better bow, it was a strategic game changer. The established historical fact here is the sheer power of the English and Welsh longbowmen. A trained archer could shoot 10, even 12 arrows a minute, creating a cloud of arrows that was devastating to the French military doctrine, which was still built around the cult of the heavily armoured knight on horseback. The French nobility, steeped in chivalric tradition, saw archery as a commoner's weapon, cowardly and dishonourable. They believed that the proper way to win a battle was a glorious, thunderous cavalry charge, and at battle after battle, the English proved them catastrophically wrong. At Crécy in 1346, a smaller English army under Edward III absolutely annihilated a massive French force. The French knights charged uphill, into the mud, straight into a storm of bodkin-tipped arrows that punched through their plate armour and pincushioned their horses. It was a massacre. The Genoese crossbowmen the French had hired were cut down before they could even get properly set up. It was a brutal lesson in modern warfare, a lesson the French would stubbornly refuse to learn for decades. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, it was a horrifying repeat. The French king himself, John II, was captured on the battlefield. Another French army shattered by a smaller Anglo-Gascon force led by Edward's son, the Black Prince. The capture of a king was the ultimate medieval jackpot. The ransom demanded for John II was astronomical. 3 million gold crowns, more than double the entire annual revenue of the French crown. This plunged France not just into a financial crisis, but a political one. With the king in captivity in London, a power vacuum opened up. The kingdom began to fracture. This period, known as the Jacquerie, saw widespread peasant revolts against the crushing taxes levied to pay the ransom, and brutal infighting among the French nobility. France was quite literally falling apart. This led to the first major English attempt to end the war on their terms, the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. Edward III agreed to renounce his claim to the French throne, but in return he was granted full sovereignty over a vast swathe of France, including Gascony and Calais. It was a victor's peace, carving out a huge independent English territory on French soil, but peace, even a punitive one, didn't last. The French, under their new king, Charles V, known as the Wise for good reason, changed tactics. They avoided big, pitched battles. They engaged in guerrilla warfare, small-scale raids, and sieges. It was a strategy of 1,000 cuts, led by brilliant commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin. They refused to give the English longbowmen the open-field battles they craved. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to win back the territory they had lost. Scholars often debate whether Charles V's Fabian strategy was a sign of military genius or simply the only option left to a kingdom too broken to field another grand army. Either way, it worked. By the time Edward III died, England held little more than a few coastal towns, including the vital port of Calais. The huge gains of Crécy and Poitiers had evaporated. This is the rhythm of the war you need to understand. A stunning English victory, a massive land grab, followed by a slow, grinding French recovery that pushes the English back to the sea. The exhaustion on both sides was immense. The war effort was ruinously expensive. England had its own internal problems, including the peasants' revolt of 1381, partly fueled by the endless taxes needed to fund the campaigns in France. For a generation, the war simmered down into a long, uneasy truce. Both kingdoms were led by ineffectual rulers, the mentally unstable Charles VI in France and the insecure, deposed Richard II in England. It seemed as though the conflict might just peter out from sheer mutual exhaustion. But the underlying issues hadn't gone away. The English still held Calais, a dagger pointed at the heart of France. And crucially, the English claim to the French throne had not been forgotten. It was merely dormant. A quirky detail from this period of truce is the sheer amount of cross-channel cultural exchange that still occurred among the nobility. Knights from both countries would visit each other's courts, participate in tournaments, and even go on crusade together, all while their respective governments were technically still locked in a state of suspended war. It was a strange dichotomy. A world where the warrior class could maintain a sense of shared identity even while their nations were mortal enemies. This long, simmering stalemate, however, had a profoundly asymmetrical effect. For England, the war was a foreign venture, a costly expedition. For France, it was a cancer eating away at its own flesh, The real victims were the French peasantry. The English armies practiced a brutal policy known as the chevauchée. This wasn't about capturing territory, it was about systematic destruction. English horsemen would ride deep into French territory with the express purpose of burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and destroying crops. The goal was to terrorise the population and wreck the French economy, to prove that the Valois king was powerless to protect his own people. Compounding this were the écorcheurs, or flayers, demobilised mercenary companies who, during the frequent truces, simply roamed the countryside, robbing and killing at will. For the average French farmer, it didn't matter if the soldiers wore the cross of St. George or the livery of a French duke. They were a scourge. After nearly 80 years of this, France was hollowed out, its people desperate, its nobility violently divided, and its king prone to debilitating bouts of madness. The stage was perfectly set for one last, decisive English invasion. Just when it seemed the war might die of old age, a new figure stepped onto the stage in England. Not a reluctant warrior or a pragmatic diplomat, but a king forged for war, a man who saw the dormant claim to the French throne not as a dusty relic, but as his sacred, God-given inheritance. This was Henry V Young, charismatic, ruthless, and pious. Henry possessed a singular, terrifying focus: to finish what his great-grandfather Edward III had started. He believed with every fibre of his being that he was the rightful king of France, and he was prepared to tear the kingdom apart to prove it. France, at this moment, was uniquely vulnerable. The French king, Charles VI, was in the grip of one of his recurring bouts of severe mental illness. He would have periods where he didn't recognise his own wife and children, where he believed he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. This royal madness created a power vacuum that was filled by a vicious civil war between two factions of the French nobility: the Armagnacs, loyal to the king's son, the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians, led by the powerful John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. They weren't just political rivals, they were killing each other in the streets of Paris. The kingdom was tearing itself apart from the inside. Henry V saw this chaos not as a tragedy, but as a divine invitation. In 1415, he renewed the war with a vengeance. He landed a small, highly disciplined army in Normandy and laid siege to the port of Harfleur. The siege was a success, but it was costly. Disease, likely dysentery, ravaged his camp, and by the time the city fell, his army was a shadow of its former self, sick and exhausted. His advisers urged him to sail back to England, but Henry, in a move of audacious bravado, decided to march his ailing army overland to the English-held safety of Calais. It was a calculated gamble, a deliberate provocation to the French. Predictably, the French took the bait. A massive army, led by the Constable of France himself, moved to intercept and crush Henry's tiny force. They finally cornered the English near a small village called Agincourt. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. The French outnumbered the English by at least 3-1, by some estimates as much as 6-1. They were fresh, confident, and laden with the flower of French chivalry. The English were starving, sick, and trapped. And this is the established historical fact that defines the moment: the terrain. The battle was fought on a narrow front, a muddy field freshly ploughed between two dense woods. This geography was Henry's secret weapon. It completely negated the French numerical superiority, forcing their vast army to funnel into a bottleneck. The night before the battle, it rained heavily, turning the field into a quagmire. The French knights, weighed down by the heavy plate armour, could barely move in the thick mud. When they advanced, it was a slow, exhausting slog, and into this packed, struggling mass of men and horses, Henry unleashed his longbowmen. Positioned on the flanks, they fired a relentless storm of arrows from a terrifyingly close range. The result was a catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed even Crécy and Poitiers. The French vanguard was annihilated. Knights were so tightly packed in the mud that those who fell couldn't get up and were suffocated or crushed by their own comrades pressing from behind. The battle turned into a gruesome, one-sided killing field. So many French nobles were taken prisoner that Henry, fearing they might rearm and overwhelm his small number of guards, made a ruthless decision. He ordered the prisoners executed. It was a shocking violation of the chivalric code, a brutal act of battlefield pragmatism that sent a shiver of horror through Christendom. Agincourt wasn't just a victory, it was the near total destruction of a generation of French leadership. The shock of Agincourt paralysed the French. Henry followed up his victory with a slow, methodical conquest of Normandy, city by city. But his greatest weapon wasn't his army. It was the ongoing French Civil War. In 1419, a disastrous event sealed France's fate. On a bridge at Montereau, during what was supposed to be a diplomatic parley, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, was assassinated by partisans of the Dauphin. The debate among historians here is fierce. Was the Dauphin Charles directly responsible for the murder? Or was it an act of hot-headed followers that he was powerless to stop? Regardless of the truth, the consequences were immediate. Philip the Good, the new Duke of Burgundy, incandescent with rage and grief, did the unthinkable. He allied himself with Henry V, formally switching sides and throwing the immense wealth and military power of Burgundy behind the English invasion. With a powerful French ally now at his side, Henry's position was unassailable. He marched on Paris, not as a conqueror, but in the eyes of the Burgundians as an avenger and a restorer of order. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This was the legal instrument of the English victory. Brokered by the Burgundians and signed by the ailing Charles VI, the treaty was stunning in its scope. A quirky but pivotal detail is that it was sealed through marriage. Henry V married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter. The treaty named Henry as the regent of France and the recognised heir to the French throne. Crucially, it explicitly disinherited the Dauphin Charles, branding him a traitor and murderer responsible for the death of John the Fearless. It legally erased him from the line of succession. The son of the English king and the French princess would be crowned king of both England and France. The dual monarchy was no longer a dream. It was enshrined in law. In our world, Henry V's premature death and the subsequent appearance of Joan of Arc would unravel it all. But in this timeline, the story takes a much darker, and for the English, far more triumphant turn. In our timeline, the story of France's resurrection is one of improbable, almost miraculous hope. It's the story of a teenage peasant girl from a forgotten village, who convinces a defeated prince that God has sent her to save France. It's the story of Joan of Arc. But in the world we are exploring tonight, that miracle never comes. The voice of God, if it was ever there, falls silent, and without that spark of divine inspiration, the flickering flame of French resistance is snuffed out for good, This is our crucial point of divergence, the moment the stream of history breaks and flows into a new, darker channel. Let's set the scene. The year is 1429. Henry IV has been dead for 7 years, and his infant son, Henry VI, is the crowned King of England and, by the terms of the Treaty of Troyes, the legally recognised King of France. The English war machine, now under the command of Henry IV's capable brother, John, Duke of Bedford, continues its methodical work. The English and their Burgundian allies control Paris, Normandy, and much of northern France. The disinherited Dauphin, Charles, holds a rump kingdom south of the Loire River, a realm derisively called the Kingdom of Bourges. His court is a place of poverty, paranoia, and despair. His armies are demoralised, his treasury is empty, and his legitimacy is in tatters. He is, by many accounts, beginning to doubt his own claim, wondering if his defeat is indeed God's judgment upon him. The strategic key to breaking this stalemate is the city of Orléans. It sits on the Loire River, the effective border between English-held France and the Dauphin's territory. If Orléans falls, the path into the heartland of French resistance will be wide open. The English understand this perfectly. In late 1428, they begin the siege. They build a series of fortifications, small castles called bastilles, that encircle the city, slowly strangling it. The French defenders are brave, but they are outnumbered and outmanoeuvred. The city is commanded by Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, a skilled and determined commander. But as the months grind on, supplies dwindle and hope begins to fade. In our world, this is where Joan arrives. She bursts onto the scene, convinces the Dauphin of her divine mission, and is given command of a relief army. Her charisma and unwavering faith electrify the French soldiers. They see her as a living saint, and under her banner they attack the English fortifications with a ferocity they haven't shown in years. They break the siege of Orléans in a mere 9 days. It's a stunning turnaround, a massive propaganda victory that changes the entire psychological dynamic of the war. It proves that the English are not invincible. But in this timeline, there is no Joan. Perhaps she never heard the voices. Perhaps she did, but was dismissed as a mad woman by a local priest. Perhaps she tried to make a journey to the Dauphin's court at Chinon, but was captured by bandits or English patrols along the way. The established historical fact is that Joan's success depended on a series of incredible long shots, being believed by cynical captains, being accepted by a desperate court, and then actually proving effective in battle. Remove any one of those unlikely events, and her story ends before it begins. In this reality, she is just a footnote, a forgotten peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to have visions. The Dauphin's court remains a nest of defeatism. Without the miraculous relief, the siege of Orléans grinds to its inevitable conclusion. There's a quirky detail about the siege. Both sides used cannons extensively, but they were still highly unpredictable. In our history, the English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, was killed early in the siege by a freak cannon shot. A lucky break for the French. In this timeline, let's say that shot misses. Salisbury, a veteran and talented commander, survives to see the siege through to its end. By the spring of 1429, with no relief army on the horizon, the city is starving. The blockade is complete. Dunois, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, negotiates a surrender. Orléans falls. The psychological impact is devastating. For the Dauphin's followers, It's the final proof of God's disfavour. The Loire River is no longer a defensible barrier. It is an open highway for the English army. The Duke of Bedford doesn't waste the opportunity. He pushes his forces south, systematically capturing the towns of the Loire Valley, Beaugency, Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, the very places Joan liberated in her Whirlwind campaign. There is no Patay, the battle where the French cavalry finally shattered the English longbowmen in an open field. Instead, there are only more sieges, more surrenders, more French nobles switching their allegiance to the winning side to save their lands and their lives. The Dauphin Charles becomes a king on the run. He flees from Bourges, then from Poitiers, his court shrinking with every retreat. His most loyal supporters begin to slip away, seeking pardons from the English regent. Scholarly debate in this alternate world would rage over the character of this uncrowned Charles VII. Was he a tragic figure? A victim of circumstance? Or was he, as his detractors claimed, weak, indecisive, and unworthy of the crown he claimed? In this timeline, history judges him harshly. He is not Charles the Victorious, but Charles the Fugitive. The failure of the maiden, the anonymous girl who never was, seals his fate. The fall of Orleans isn't just a military defeat. It is the death of a prophecy, the end of a nation's hope. The path is now clear for the English to eradicate the last vestiges of Valois power and to finally make the Dual Monarchy a hard, physical reality across the entirety of France. With Orleans fallen and the mythical power of the Valois cause shattered, the war enters its final, brutal phase. This is no longer a contest of equals or even a struggle for supremacy. It is a methodical consolidation of conquest, the systematic crushing of what remains of an independent France. The Duke of Bedford, acting as regent for the young Henry VI, proves to be as skilled a statesman as he is a general. He understands that military victory is only half the battle. The other half is convincing the French people, or at least their elites, to accept the new reality. The campaign following the fall of Orleans is a masterclass in combined arms and political pressure. The English and their indispensable Burgundian allies push south and west from the Loire Valley, a two-pronged advance that aims to isolate and destroy the last pockets of Armagnac, or Valois resistance. Bedford leads one army, while Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, leads another. The established historical fact that underpins this final phase is the overwhelming financial superiority of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. They control Paris, Normandy, and Flanders, the wealthiest and most urbanized regions. They can afford to pay their soldiers regularly, hire the best mercenaries, and invest in the expensive siege artillery needed to reduce the walled towns that are loyal to the Dauphin. The Dauphin, by contrast, is virtually bankrupt, forced to rely on the dwindling loyalty of a few great nobles in the south. The advance is relentless. Town after town is presented with a choice. Open your gates, swear allegiance to King Henry VI, and retain your civic privileges, or resist and face a siege, which will inevitably end with the sacking of your town and the execution of its leaders. For most city councils, it's not much of a choice. The memory of what happened to cities that resisted, like Rouen years earlier, is still fresh. So, Bourges, the Dauphin's own provisional capital, surrenders, then Poitiers. The English march down the Atlantic coast, securing the remnants of Gascony and linking up with their ancestral holdings around Bordeaux. The kingdom of Bourges dissolves like mist in the morning sun. the Dauphin Charles becomes a wanderer in his own kingdom, hunted and increasingly isolated. He retreats towards the south, into the rugged terrain of the Massif Central, and eventually further towards the Pyrenees. His flight is a sad spectacle, a court on the move, shedding followers and prestige with every league travelled. A quirky, humanising detail of this period is the flourishing of a black market in safe conduct passes. For a hefty price, unscrupulous officials on both sides would sell documents allowing merchants, or even fleeing Valois loyalists, to pass through military lines. It's a small, cynical reminder that even in a war of national survival, personal profit often finds a way. The final major military confrontation is not a grand battle like Agincourt, but a desperate, drawn-out siege. Let's imagine it takes place at Toulouse, one of the last great southern cities loyal to the Valois cause. The Dauphin makes his last stand here, rallying his few remaining loyal nobles, including the fierce Gascon lords who have a long and complicated history with the English crown. For months, the city holds out, a symbol of defiance. But Bedford and the Burgundians bring their immense logistical power to bear. They encircle the city with a vast network of trenches and forts, just as they did at Orléans. Their cannons, including massive siege guns with names like Le Diable, systematically pound the walls into rubble. Inside the city, starvation and disease set in. The end comes not with a bang, but with a whimper. The city fathers, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, override the Dauphin's commanders and negotiate a surrender to save the populace from a final bloody assault. The capture of Toulouse effectively ends the war. The Dauphin Charles, now a king with no kingdom and no army, is forced into exile. He might flee to the court of an ally, perhaps in Castile or Scotland, where he would live out his days as a tragic, forgotten figure, a pretender whose claims grow more irrelevant with each passing year. Or perhaps, in a final indignity, he is captured. The scholarly debate in this alternate world would centre on what to do with him. Would the English execute him as a traitor, as the Treaty of Troyes demanded? This would be risky, as it could create a martyr. More likely, they would subject him to a public humiliation, forcing him to renounce his claim before imprisoning him for life in the Tower of London, a living symbol of the Valois dynasty's failure. With the Dauphin gone, the last vestiges of organised resistance crumble. A few holdouts remain, isolated castles in the Auvergne, die-hard partisans in the forest of the Limousin, but these are now matters for police action, not military campaigns. The Duke of Bedford can finally turn his full attention from conquering France to governing it. The 100 Years' War is over, not in a truce, not in a stalemate, but in a clear, unambiguous, and total English victory. The leopards of England now fly unchallenged over Paris, Rouen, Bordeaux, and Orléans. The monumental task of transforming this military conquest into a stable, functioning political entity, the dual monarchy of England and France, can now begin. The dream of Henry V is a reality, and the map of Europe is irrevocably changed. The last Valois banner has been lowered. The last pocket of resistance has been pacified. The war is won, but for the English crown, the victory presents a problem far more complex than any battle. How do you actually govern this vast, resentful, and profoundly different kingdom? How do you forge a single state, a dual monarchy from two realms with separate laws, languages, customs, and a century of fresh, bitter hatred between them? This is the great administrative challenge that consumes the English Regency under the Duke of Bedford and, later, the court of the adult Henry VI. The first and most immediate task is to establish a clear structure of governance. They don't try to obliterate French institutions. That would be impossible and foolish. Instead, they co-opt them. The established historical fact that makes this feasible is that medieval kingdoms were not centralised nation-states in the modern sense. They were a patchwork of provinces and fiefdoms, each with its own local customs and legal traditions, the coutumes. The English crown simply places itself at the apex of the existing French system. The Parlement of Paris, the Supreme Court of France, continues to function, but its judgments are now subject to final appeal to the King's Council, which might be sitting in London or Rouen. The French system of tax collection, the taillis and the gabelle, is kept in place, and in fact made more ruthlessly efficient to pay for the ongoing costs of occupation and administration. The centre of English power in France is deliberately split. Paris remains the symbolic and ceremonial capital. It is here, at Notre Dame, that the young Henry VI is formally crowned King of France, a lavish ceremony designed to awe the French nobility and legitimise his rule in the eyes of God and man. But the real administrative and military hub is established in Rouen, the capital of Normandy. Normandy has been under English control for a generation now, and its populace is more pacified. Rouen is also strategically vital, controlling the Seine river valley and offering easy access back to England. The Duke of Bedford establishes his main residence there, and it becomes the headquarters for the English army of occupation and the growing bureaucracy needed to manage the kingdom. The structure of this new government is a hybrid. The great offices of the French state, the Chancellor, the Constable, the Grand Maître, are preserved. Initially, many of these posts are given to high-ranking English nobles as rewards for their service in the war. An Englishman is the Constable of France, giving him command of all military forces. Another might be the Chancellor, controlling the state seal and the legal machinery. However, Bedford is pragmatic. He knows he cannot rule France with Englishmen alone. He actively cultivates a party of collaborationist French nobles, primarily those from the former Burgundian faction. These French lords are given secondary positions, seats on the royal council, and, most importantly, confirmation of their land titles. This creates a new, blended ruling class, a cross-channel elite bound by mutual self-interest to the survival of the Lancastrian regime. Language becomes a crucial tool of statecraft. Officially, the court of the Dual Monarchy is bilingual. Latin remains the language of the church and high diplomacy. But for administrative matters, a dual language policy is enacted. All royal edicts and legal judgments are issued in both Middle English and Parisian French. This has a quirky, unforeseen consequence. It creates a class of highly sought-after scribes and clerks who are fluent in both tongues. These bilingual bureaucrats become the essential cogs in the machine of the new state, and their services are richly rewarded. More likely, they would subject him to a public humiliation, forcing him to renounce his claim before imprisoning him for life in the Tower of London, a living symbol of the Valois dynasty's failure. With the Dauphin gone, the last vestiges of organised resistance crumble. Over time, this practical necessity starts to create a new administrative dialect, a formal, slightly stilted version of English heavily loaded with French legal and political vocabulary. even more so than in our timeline. But beneath this veneer of institutional continuity and forced cooperation, the reality is one of military occupation. English garrisons are maintained in every major French city. The Bastille in Paris and the great castle of Rouen are expanded, becoming potent symbols of English dominance. The primary role of these garrisons is not to fight foreign enemies, but to suppress internal dissent and ensure the prompt collection of taxes. The cost of maintaining this army is enormous, and it falls squarely on the French population. The tax burden, already heavy under the Valois, becomes even more crushing under the English, breeding a deep and lasting resentment that festers beneath the surface of the pacified kingdom. A scholarly debate rages in this alternate future about the long-term viability of this structure. Was the dual monarchy a brilliant feat of state building or a monstrous, unstable chimera destined to tear itself apart? Optimists point to the pragmatic policies of Bedford, the creation of a shared aristocracy, and the economic benefits of controlling trade from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Pessimists point to the crushing tax burden, the simmering resentment of the general populace, and the fundamental cultural chasm between the two realms. They argue that the Union is held together only by military force, and that any sign of weakness in the English crown would cause the entire edifice to collapse. For now, however, in the mid-15th century, the system holds. The two-headed crown, worn by an English king, sits securely, its gaze fixed in two directions at once, across the Channel, holding a fragile and unprecedented kingdom together through a mixture of shrewd politics, shared greed, and cold steel. The victory of the House of Lancaster is necessarily the death of the House of Valois. For the family that had ruled France for over a century, the English triumph is an extinction-level event. The end doesn't come in a single clean chop, but in a slow, humiliating fade into irrelevance and exile. The shadow of the Valois dynasty, once the most prestigious in Europe, now shrinks and dissipates, leaving behind a power vacuum eagerly filled by their conquerors. Let's trace the fate of the key figures. The Dauphin Charles, whom we left fleeing after the fall of Toulouse, embodies the collapse. In this timeline, he is not Charles the Victorious, but Charles the Exile, or Charles the Pretender. He likely finds refuge in a court sympathetic to his cause, perhaps in Scotland, a traditional enemy of England, or in the Kingdom of Castile, which has its own rivalries with the new Anglo-French superpower. He becomes a political pawn, a ghost at foreign feasts. His pleas for armies and funds to reclaim his stolen kingdom are met with polite sympathy but little concrete support. No one is willing to risk a direct war with the formidable dual monarchy for the sake of a king with no country. His court, composed of a handful of die-hard loyalists who lost everything, becomes a bitter, impoverished place, consumed by infighting and fading hopes. He dies in obscurity, passing his now empty claim to a son who inherits a title but not a kingdom. The Valois claim becomes a historical curiosity, like the claims of the Byzantine emperors after the fall of Constantinople. For the Valois partisans who remained in France, the aftermath is a grim reckoning. The English regency, under the shrewd Duke of Bedford, pursues a calculated policy of punishment and reward. The established historical fact here is that medieval warfare and politics were intensely personal and centred on oaths of fealty. Breaking an oath was a serious crime. Therefore, those nobles who had been the most ardent supporters of the Dauphin, the leaders of the Armagnac faction, are singled out for harsh treatment. They are declared traitors, not just to the English king, but to the legitimate order of the French kingdom as defined by the Treaty of Troyes. Their fates vary. The most powerful and defiant, those captured in the final campaigns, are likely tried for treason by the Parlement of Paris, now controlled by pro-English judges, and executed. Their heads are displayed on spikes on the gates of Paris or Rouen, a gruesome warning to others. A greater number have their lands and titles confiscated. The vast estates of the Duke of Alençon, the Count of Armagnac, and other Valois loyalists are seized by the crown. This massive portfolio of confiscated land becomes the currency with which the new regime rewards its friends and cements its power. The lesser Valois supporters, the minor lords and knights, are often given a choice. Swear a new binding oath of fealty to Henry VI and pay a ruinous fine, or be stripped of their property and exiled. Most, with families to protect and no other way to live, choose to bend the knee. This creates a class of resentful but subjugated new loyalists, their allegiance thin and their loyalty suspect, a potential source of trouble for generations to come. The cultural impact of the Valois disappearance is profound. For over 300 years, first the Capetians and then their Valois cousins had been the heart of French political and cultural life. They were the patrons of the arts, the builders of cathedrals and castles, the living symbols of the kingdom. Now, that centre is gone. A quirky but telling detail is the abrupt halt in the development of the distinctively French, flamboyant Gothic architectural style. The great building projects, sponsored by the Valois, new wings for the Louvre, lavish ducal palaces in the Loire, are left unfinished or are completed in the more austere, rigid English perpendicular style favoured by the new masters. French culture, for a time, loses its great patrons and its self-confidence. The vibrant, flamboyant spirit of the Valois court is replaced by the more sober, martial atmosphere of the English administration. Scholarly debate in this alternate world would focus on whether the Valois were doomed by their own internal divisions long before the English delivered the final blow. Was the Armagnac-Burgundian civil war the true cause of France's defeat, with Henry V merely acting as the opportunistic executioner? Many would argue yes. The assassination of John the Fearless on the bridge at Montereau was a political suicide note for the Valois dynasty. It drove the most powerful duchy in France into the arms of the English and shattered any hope of a united French front. In this view, the English didn't so much win the war as the Valois lost it. The Valois fade from the main stage of European history, but they do not vanish completely. Cadet branches of the family, like the Dukes of Orleans and Angoulême, who had been captured in earlier battles like Agincourt and held for ransom in England, might eventually be released. They would return to a France utterly transformed, their own royal connections now a source of suspicion rather than prestige. They would live as diminished figures, great nobles certainly, but with no path to the throne, forever in the shadow of their English overlords. The fleur-de-lis, the golden lily of France, is still present on the royal standard, but it is now permanently quartered with the leopards of England. It is no longer a symbol of an independent kingdom, but a badge of ownership, a trophy of a war won and a dynasty broken. With the Valois dynasty effectively erased and their most powerful supporters dispossessed, a vast landscape of power, wealth and influence lies vacant. The English crown now holds a staggering portfolio of confiscated French lands, titles, and castles. This is the spoil of a century of war, and its distribution will define the political reality of the dual monarchy for the next 100 years. It is the raw material from which a new hybrid aristocracy will be forged, an elite whose fortunes are inextricably tied to the success of the Anglo-French Union. The process begins immediately, a grand and strategic redistribution of property. The Duke of Bedford, as regent, understands that he needs to reward the English captains and nobles who fought for the crown, but he also needs to secure the loyalty of his crucial Burgundian allies and the French nobles who chose to collaborate. It's a delicate balancing act. The top prizes, the great ducal and committal titles of the defeated Armagnacs, go to the highest ranking Englishmen. Imagine a leading English commander, perhaps a Talbot or a Beaufort, who was instrumental in the final campaigns, being granted the Duchy of Anjou or the County of Maine. Suddenly, an English family that held estates in Shropshire now also controls a vast territory in the Loire Valley. Their income and their political influence multiplies overnight. This creates a new breed of nobleman, a cross-channel magnate. These lords now have interests on both sides of the water. They might attend the Parliament at Westminster one month and the Parlement of Paris the next. They need to manage estates with English tenants speaking Middle English and French peasants speaking a dialect of Languedoil. They have to understand the common law of England and the customary law of Normandy or Poitou. The established historical fact that facilitates this is the already existing French-speaking culture of the English aristocracy. Ever since the Norman conquest of 1066, French had been the language of the English court and nobility. While this was fading by the 15th century, the linguistic and cultural groundwork was still there. It makes the transition to becoming a bilingual, bicultural ruling class less of a leap than it might seem. They are not strangers in a strange land. They are, in a sense, reclaiming a part of their own heritage. This land grant policy has a second crucial purpose: strategic control. English lords are deliberately settled in areas of former Valois loyalty. A new English Duke of Alençon is not just being rewarded, he is being tasked with pacifying a historically rebellious region. The Crown grants these lords significant autonomy, including the right to raise troops and administer justice, effectively subcontracting the business of occupation. A quirky detail of this era is the emergence of hybrid family crests. An English family like the Nevilles, whose badge was the bear and ragged staff, might marry into a collaborationist French family like the de Montmorency. Their heirs would then display a new coat of arms quartering the English and French symbols, a visual representation of the new fused nobility. Of course, the English cannot rule alone. The Burgundians, whose alliance was the key to victory, must be rewarded. Duke Philip the Good, already one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, has his territories expanded and his full sovereignty within those lands confirmed. He remains a vassal of the French crown in theory, but in practice he is an allied king. Furthermore, the lesser French nobles who sided with the Anglo-Burgundian faction, the collaborators, are also confirmed in their lands and given minor new titles. This creates a clear hierarchy: an English upper tier, a powerful Burgundian partner, and a subordinate but still privileged class of French loyalists. It's a system designed to be stable, balancing the interests of the different factions that support the Lancastrian regime. The economic consequences of this shift are enormous. The new Anglo-French lords are not sentimentalists. They seek to maximise the income from their new French estates. They often import English administrative methods, appointing English or loyal French reeves and bailiffs to manage their properties. They are keen to rationalise agricultural production and promote the export of French goods, wine from Gascony, wheat from the Paris basin, salt from the Atlantic coast to English markets. This leads to a much more integrated cross-channel economy. While this benefits the merchant class in ports like London, Southampton, Bordeaux and Rouen, it often comes at the expense of the French peasantry, who face more efficient and demanding landlords. The great scholarly debate in this alternate world is whether this new aristocracy ever truly fused. Did they become a genuine Anglo-French nobility? Or did they remain two separate groups, an English overclass and a French underclass, bound together only by political necessity? For the first few generations, the answer is likely the latter. English lords would still primarily marry their sons and daughters to other English families. Their cultural heart would remain in England. They would see their French estates as a source of revenue and power, but not necessarily as home. However, over a century or two, this might begin to change. As generations are born and raised on French soil, as they speak French fluently from childhood, as their economic fortunes become entirely dependent on their continental holdings, a genuine cultural fusion might start to take place. The line between English and French at the highest level of society would begin to blur, creating a unique ruling class that Europe has never seen before. This new nobility, born from conquest and collaboration, is the backbone of the Dual Monarchy, its greatest strength and perhaps its most significant long-term vulnerability. The success of the English conquest and the establishment of the Dual Monarchy were not achieved alone. They were made possible by one crucial, game-changing factor: the alliance with the Duchy of Burgundy. In our history, this alliance was a temporary, albeit decisive, marriage of convenience that fell apart within a generation. But in this new timeline, where the English victory is total and permanent, the relationship with Burgundy evolves into something far more lasting and complex. The duchy, once a rival to the French crown, now finds itself in a new role, the permanent junior and sometimes resentful partner in an Anglo-French superpower. To understand Burgundy's position, you have to appreciate its immense power. The established historical fact is that the 15th century Duchy of Burgundy was far more than just the French region we know today. Through a shrewd series of marriages, inheritances, and conquests, the Dukes of Burgundy had assembled a vast collection of territories, a middle kingdom stretching from the borders of Switzerland all the way to the North Sea. It included not just the Duchy and County of Burgundy, but also the incredibly wealthy and urbanized lands of Flanders, Brabant, and Holland, what we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. The court of Duke Philip the Good was the most glittering and opulent in Europe, a centre of art, finance, and chivalric culture that outshone both London and the diminished Paris. In our timeline, after the English position in France weakened, Philip the Good abandoned the alliance at the Congress of Arras in 1435. He reconciled with Charles VII in exchange for massive concessions that made him virtually independent. It was a diplomatic triumph that sealed the fate of the English cause. But in this alternate reality, the Congress of Arras goes very differently. With the English having decisively crushed the Valois, there is no Charles VII to reconcile with. The English are the only game in town. Philip the Good has no exit ramp from the alliance. His fortunes are now permanently tied to the stability of the Lancastrian regime he helped create. The Anglo-Burgundian relationship is therefore renegotiated from a position of overwhelming English strength. The Duke of Burgundy is handsomely rewarded, of course. His full sovereignty over his core territories is recognised. He might even be granted some border regions, like Champagne, as a buffer state. But the dream of total independence, of being crowned a king in his own right, is subtly but firmly quashed. He remains in title the first peer of the French realm, a vassal to Henry VI, King of England and France. His role is to be the great continental bulwark of the Dual Monarchy, its primary ally and its guardian on the border with the Holy Roman Empire. This creates a fascinating and tense dynamic. On the one hand, the alliance is mutually beneficial. Burgundy benefits from the military protection of the English crown and enjoys preferential access to the massive English wool market, which is vital for its cloth-producing cities like Bruges and Ghent. The dual monarchy, in turn, relies on Burgundian administrative expertise and their deep connections within the Holy Roman Empire. The two powers work together to dominate the politics and trade of northwestern Europe. A quirky detail of this era would be the joint Anglo-Burgundian sponsorship of chivalric orders. The English Order of the Garter and the Burgundian Order of the Golden Fleece would hold joint chapters, their knights mingling and reinforcing a shared elite culture, a brotherhood of arms that papers over the political tensions. On the other hand, a deep-seated rivalry simmers just beneath the surface. The Burgundian court never quite loses its sense of being the cultural and economic superior. They see the English as effective soldiers, but as somewhat brutish and unsophisticated. The English, in turn, view the Burgundians as flamboyant, arrogant, and occasionally untrustworthy. The scholarly debate here would focus on whether Burgundy was a willing partner or a gilded hostage. Was Philip the Good, and his even more ambitious son, Charles the Bold, content with their position as the glorious second-in-command, or were they constantly, secretly, looking for ways to undermine their English overlords and achieve true independence? The reign of Charles the Bold, who in our history died fighting for his dream of a new kingdom, would be particularly tense. A man of immense ambition and pride, he would chafe under the constraints of the alliance. He might try to expand his power eastwards into Germany, carving out a domain far from English influence. This could lead to friction, as the English king would be wary of his most powerful vassal becoming too powerful. There might be diplomatic crises, proxy conflict fought in the fractured territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and endless courtly intrigue. Charles's ultimate fate would be a defining moment. If he overreaches and is defeated, as he was in our timeline, the English crown might seize the opportunity to absorb the Duchy of Burgundy itself, finally neutering its powerful partner. If he succeeds, he might force a renegotiation of the entire relationship, creating a truly equal partnership or even breaking away entirely. For now, however, the alliance holds, a cornerstone of the new European order. The Duke of Burgundy acts as the vice-regent for the French-speaking eastern territories of the kingdom. His court at Dijon, a lavish satellite of the main royal court. The relationship is a complex dance of cooperation and competition, a permanent feature of the political landscape. The betrayal at Montereau that created the alliance is never forgotten, but it is subsumed into a new reality. Burgundy, the rogue state that enabled the English victory, is now permanently leashed to the two-headed crown it helped to forge, its own destiny forever altered by the consequences of its fateful choice. The creation of the dual monarchy of England and France isn't just a regional event, it's a geopolitical earthquake that shatters the old medieval order and sends shockwaves across the continent. The political map of Europe, a familiar constellation of powers for centuries, is suddenly and violently redrawn. In the place of two rival kingdoms, constantly checking each other's power, there now stands a single, colossal entity that dominates the western half of the continent. The birth of this Anglo-French superpower forces every other state, from the fractured Italian city-states to the sprawling Holy Roman Empire, to reassess its position and recalculate its future. The most immediate impact is felt by France's traditional allies, who suddenly find themselves facing a much more formidable foe. The established historical fact here is the old alliance between France and Scotland. For centuries, this alliance had been a strategic cornerstone for both nations. Whenever England invaded France, Scotland would invade England from the north, forcing the English to fight a war on two fronts. It was a brilliant and effective arrangement. With the Valois dynasty gone, this alliance is effectively void. Scotland is now terrifyingly isolated, facing an enemy that is not just England, but an England that can draw upon the immense wealth and manpower of France. The Anglo-French crown would likely adopt a far more aggressive posture towards Scotland, seeking to neutralise this northern threat once and for all. A full-scale invasion and conquest of Scotland, a feat that had eluded English kings for centuries, now becomes a distinct possibility. Further south, the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal, must also adapt. Castile, a traditional ally of the Valois, now finds itself bordering a superpower. Its own ambitions to expand are suddenly checked. The political gravity of the region shifts dramatically. Instead of looking to Paris for alliances, the Spanish kingdoms are now forced into a new and uneasy relationship with the court of the dual monarchy. A quirky side effect of this is that the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim Spain from the Moors, might accelerate. With the Anglo-French behemoth to their north, the Spanish kingdoms might turn their energies southward with renewed vigour, seeing the conquest of Granada as a way to consolidate their own power in a now much more dangerous neighbourhood. The great power of Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, is also profoundly affected. A loose, decentralised confederation of hundreds of states, the empire has long benefited from the Franco-English rivalry, often playing one side against the other. Now, it faces a unified power on its western flank that dwarfs any single German prince. The emperor, who holds a prestigious but often weak position, would find his authority challenged. The western states of the empire, the Rhineland, Switzerland, Savoy, would fall directly into the economic and political orbit of the Anglo-French Union. The new superpower would likely seek to expand its influence eastward, nibbling away at imperial territory, a prospect that would terrify the Habsburg emperors and could lead to a new century-spanning rivalry between the Anglo-French bloc and a more unified German-Austrian bloc. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact is on the papacy and the Italian city-states. The 14th and early 15th centuries had been a time of papal weakness, with the Avignon papacy, where the popes resided in France, under the thumb of the French king, and the subsequent Great Schism. The English victory creates a new dynamic. The King of England and France is now the most powerful monarch in Christendom. His influence on the election of popes and the politics of the Church immense. The papacy, located in Rome, would have to tread very carefully, balancing the immense power of the Anglo-French crown against the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Spanish kings. A fascinating scholarly debate would emerge here. Would this new superpower lead to a more stable, unified Christendom? Or would its very existence provoke new and more terrible religious and political conflicts? The economic balance of power also shifts decisively. The dual monarchy now controls both sides of the English Channel, turning it from a contested strait into an Anglo-French lake. It dominates the trade routes of the Atlantic seaboard, from the wool trade of the North Sea to the wine trade of Bordeaux. The great financial centres of the New Kingdom, London, Paris, Bruges in the Burgundian sphere, and Bordeaux form an unrivalled economic axis. This gives the Anglo-French crown a financial leverage that no other European power can match. It can fund larger armies, build bigger fleets, and sustain longer wars than any of its rivals. The Italian maritime republics, like Venice and Genoa, who had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, would suddenly find themselves facing a new and powerful Atlantic competitor, a force that would soon be looking to bypass their old trade routes entirely. In essence, the English victory creates a hegemonic power in Western Europe. The old multipolar system is gone. The continent is now forced to organise itself around this new central fact. Alliances will be reformed, rivalries will be redefined, and the entire political and economic landscape will be tilted on its new Anglo-French axis. This new superpower, born of war and conquest, now stands astride the continent, casting a very long shadow that will shape the destiny of every other nation for generations to come. The consolidation of the dual monarchy doesn't just reshape the political map of Europe, it fundamentally alters the trajectory of global history by creating a maritime superpower perfectly poised to dominate the dawn of the Age of Discovery. In our timeline, the great pioneers of early exploration were Portugal and Spain, nations on the Atlantic fringe driven by a quest for trade routes to the east that would bypass the Venetian and Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. But in this alternate reality, the new Anglo-French Union possesses advantages that would likely allow it to leapfrog these Iberian pioneers and become the undisputed master of the oceans. Consider the geography. The established historical fact that forms the basis of this advantage is the dual monarchy's complete control of the Atlantic coastline from the northern tip of Scotland down to the Pyrenees. It holds every major deep water port and navigable river mouth in Western Europe: London, Southampton, Bristol, Rouen, Nantes, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux. This gives it an unparalleled collection of shipbuilding centres, experienced seafaring populations, and strategic launching points for westward and southward voyages. The fishermen of Brittany and Cornwall, the wine merchants of Gascony, the wool traders of England, all contribute to a massive pool of maritime knowledge and capital. The English Channel and the Bay of Biscay are no longer contested frontiers, but secure domestic waterways. a vast training ground for sailors and a safe harbour for fleets. The economic and political impetus for exploration would also be immense. With the kingdom unified, the crown would be eager to find new sources of wealth to fund its massive administration and army of occupation. The quest for gold, spices, and a direct sea route to the riches of Asia, which motivated Columbus and Vasco da Gama, would be just as potent, if not more so, for the court in London and Paris. Furthermore, the Union possesses a unique combination of resources. England provides the capital from its booming wool trade and sophisticated London financiers. It also contributes its robust shipbuilding tradition and its battle-hardened naval commanders. France, in turn, provides the sheer manpower and agricultural wealth to sustain these large-scale expeditions. It is a perfect synergy of maritime and continental power. So, who are the explorers in this new timeline? Perhaps it isn't an Italian named Columbus seeking patronage from the Spanish courts. Maybe it's a Breton captain from Saint-Malo or a Cornish adventurer from Valois who sails into the royal court with a bold new proposal. He secures funding not from a single monarch, but from a consortium of Anglo-French nobles and London merchants, all eager for a return on their investment. When this alternate Columbus sets sail in, let's say, 1485, his ships might fly a banner combining the cross of St. George and the fleur-de-lis. When these explorers discover the Americas, the consequences are immediate and overwhelming. The Dual Monarchy has the population, the wealth, and the military power to colonise on a scale that Spain and Portugal could only dream of. Instead of a handful of conquistadors, imagine waves of settlers, not just from one nation but from two. English farmers seeking new lands, and French habitants establishing seigneuries along the rivers of this new Normandy or Nouvelle Angleterre. The colonisation of North America would happen faster, be more systematic, and be driven by a single unified imperial policy. A quirky detail here might be the names on the map. Instead of New York, you might have New Rouen. Instead of Virginia, perhaps a territory named Henriana, after the victorious King Henry VI. The St. Lawrence River might be charted by a Bristol captain and named the New Thames. The linguistic and cultural landscape of the future Americas would be a fascinating blend of English and French from the very beginning. The rivalry with the Iberian powers would be intense. Spain and Portugal would still likely explore and claim parts of South and Central America, as dictated by a papal bull like the Treaty of Tordesillas. But in this timeline, the Pope would be under immense pressure from the Anglo-French crown. The line of demarcation would almost certainly be drawn far more favourably for the northern superpower. The scholarly debate would centre on whether this would lead to an earlier and more massive colonial war between the Anglo-French and the Spanish. With the dual monarchy controlling the seas of northern Europe, it could easily blockade and harass Spanish treasure fleets returning from the New World, choking off the silver that funded the Spanish Empire in our history. The Caribbean would become the flashpoint for a massive naval conflict between these two emerging colonial blocs. This maritime dominance would also extend eastward. The search for a sea route to India around Africa, pioneered by the Portuguese, would be a major goal for the Anglo-French. With their superior resources, they might beat the Portuguese to it, or at least establish rival trading posts along the African coast and in the Indian Ocean much earlier and more aggressively. The Anglo-French East India Company, founded a century earlier than in our timeline, would be a commercial and military juggernaut, challenging not just the Portuguese, but also the existing Arab and Venetian trade networks. In essence, the English victory in the 100 Years' War preempts the rise of Spain and Portugal as the first global empires. The dual monarchy becomes the world's first true oceanic hegemon, its power projected across the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean. The wealth that flows back from these new colonies, gold from the Aztecs, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the East, would solidify the power of the Anglo-French crown to an almost unimaginable degree, funding its European armies and fleets and making it the unchallengeable centre of a new global system. The Age of Discovery would dawn not with a Spanish or Portuguese accent, but with a curious Anglo-French one. While the dual monarchy projects an image of unprecedented strength abroad, its creation unleashes a slow-burning identity crisis within its English heartland. For centuries, the struggle against France had been a defining feature of what it meant to be English. The longbowmen at Crécy, the defiant stand against a larger, arrogant foe, these were foundational myths. Now, the enemy has been absorbed. The king on the throne in Westminster is also the king in the Louvre. The political, cultural, and linguistic centre of gravity of this new, sprawling kingdom begins to tilt inexorably south, across the Channel, and this shift has profound and unsettling consequences for England itself. Initially, the victory is a source of immense national pride. Ballads are sung about Agincourt, and Henry V is lionised as the greatest of English heroes. But as the decades pass, a sense of unease creeps in. The king and his court spend more and more time in France. Paris, after all, is the larger, wealthier, and more prestigious capital. It is the heart of the continental half of the kingdom, and governing it requires the monarch's presence. The king's English progresses become less frequent. For the average person in England, the monarch becomes a more distant figure, an overlord who resides in a foreign capital, surrounded by a new bilingual nobility. The established historical fact that exacerbates this is England's own sense of exceptionalism, its identity as an island nation. The sea had always been a barrier, a defence. Now, with the Crown's interests so heavily invested on the continent, that comforting sense of separation is lost. England is no longer an island kingdom, but the northern province of a continental empire. This shift is felt most acutely in the language. In our timeline, the 15th century was the period when English triumphantly supplanted French as the language of the elite and the government. But in this reality, the process is arrested and partially reversed. At the highest level of the dual monarchy, French, specifically the dialect of Paris, reasserts its prestige. It is the language of the larger population, the language of diplomacy, and the language of the sophisticated Burgundian court. To be an influential figure in the new order, you must be fluent in French. Ambitious English nobles ensure their sons are tutored in Parisian French, not just the old provincial Anglo-Norman. The result is that the English language, while still spoken by the vast majority of the population, finds its development subtly altered. A quirky linguistic outcome is the survival of many French-derived gentry words that in our world fell out of use. English high society might continue to use words like serviette instead of napkin, or portmanteau instead of suitcase, for centuries longer, marking a clear class distinction in speech. The political structure of England also begins to change. Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, had grown strong during the 100 Years' War precisely because the king constantly needed to ask it for money to fund his campaigns. This power of the purse was the bedrock of its influence. But now, the king has a new, immense source of revenue that he can access without Parliament's consent: the tax base of France. The crushing taille and gabelle levied on the French peasantry now flow into the royal coffers. This financial independence makes the Anglo-French monarch far less dependent on his English Parliament. He no longer has to bargain with the Commons for funds. The result is a slow erosion of Parliament's power. It might continue to meet, but it would be a diminished, more ceremonial body, its legislative role increasingly usurped by royal proclamations issued from Paris or Rouen. England, in this timeline, might never develop the robust parliamentary tradition that became its defining political legacy. It could instead drift towards the model of French absolutism. This leads to a growing sense of alienation and resentment. The gentry and merchants of England, who had been gaining political power, now find themselves marginalised. They see their taxes being used to pay for garrisons in Normandy or to build palaces on the Loire. They see the best and most lucrative positions in the new administration going to the great cross-channel magnates who spend most of their time abroad. The scholarly debate in this alternate world would be on the rise of a new English nationalism. This wouldn't be the jingoistic nationalism of empire, but a more defensive, resentful nationalism. It would be a movement arguing that the union with France has been a disaster for England itself, draining its resources, corrupting its language, and undermining its ancient liberties. This discontent could find a voice. Perhaps a charismatic nobleman who lost out in the distribution of French lands, or a popular London merchant, could start a political faction demanding England for the English. This movement would be seen as treasonous by the Crown, of course, and would be brutally suppressed. But the sentiment would fester. There might be tax revolts in Kent or peasant uprisings in Yorkshire, not unlike the ones that occurred in our history, but this time they would have a distinctly anti-French, anti-continental character. The great irony is that by winning the war and conquering France, the English monarchy may have sown the seeds of a future civil war. Not a dynastic squabble between rival aristocratic houses like the Wars of the Roses, but a genuine ideological conflict between the imperial crown and a burgeoning English nationalist movement fighting to reclaim its own identity. England, the victor, finds itself culturally and politically captive to its prize. Just as the Anglo-French Union is consolidating its power, a cultural tidal wave begins to roll across Europe from the south. The Italian Renaissance, the rebirth of classical art, learning and philosophy, is reaching its zenith. In our history, the spirit of the Renaissance was carried into France by armies invading Italy and was adopted with unique fervour by the Valois kings like Francis I. In England, it arrived later and in a more muted literary form. But in the world of the Dual Monarchy, this cultural wave encounters a completely different shoreline, a single, massive political entity with a unique cultural filter. The Renaissance, therefore, arrives and is transformed differently. The court of the Dual Monarchy, whether residing in Paris, London, or the lavish Burgundian palaces, becomes the wealthiest and most powerful patronage hub in Northern Europe. Italian artists, architects, and scholars, who in our world flock to the courts of the Valois or the Tudors, are now drawn into the orbit of this single, colossal patron. An Italian artist like Leonardo da Vinci might still end his days in the service of a great monarch, but instead of the French king at Amboise, he might find himself working for the Anglo-French court at a newly rebuilt Louvre or even a drastically expanded Windsor Castle. However, the culture of this court is not the same as that of the Valois. The established historical fact here is the distinct aesthetic of the English perpendicular Gothic style and the concurrent flamboyant style in France. The English style was more restrained, linear, and structured, while the French was ornate, fiery, and exuberant. The culture of the Lancastrian court, influenced by the martial piety of Henry V and the sober administrative tone of the Regency, would favour the former. Therefore, when the Renaissance arrives, its classical motifs, the columns, the rounded arches, the celebration of the human form, are not absorbed into the flamboyant French style, but are instead grafted onto the more rigid, structural English aesthetic. Imagine the architecture that results. Great halls with the massive fan-vaulted ceilings, characteristic of English cathedrals, but with walls decorated with classical frescoes instead of tapestries. Chateaux in the Loire Valley are rebuilt not with the playful turrets and spires of a Chambord, but with the grand, symmetrical, and slightly forbidding facades of an English prodigy house like Hampton Court. The result is a new, hybrid Anglo-Gothic Renaissance style, impressive and monumental, but perhaps lacking the lightness and grace of either its Italian or French counterparts in our timeline. In the realm of ideas, the impact is just as profound. The humanism of the Italian Renaissance celebrated the potential of man and revived the study of classical Greek and Roman texts. In the Dual Monarchy, this intellectual movement is filtered through the specific needs and anxieties of the state. The Crown would lavishly fund scholars, but their work would be directed towards practical ends. A quirky detail is the focus on historical scholarship. The new regime desperately needs to legitimize itself. So, humanist scholars are employed to write grand, sweeping histories that portray the English victory not as a conquest, but as the rightful and divinely ordained culmination of a shared Anglo-French destiny stretching back to Charlemagne, or even the Roman Empire. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart from a century earlier provided a template, and now this is state-funded propaganda on a massive scale. Think of it as a 15th century version of Virgil's Aeneid, written not for a Roman emperor, but for the Lancastrian king of two realms. The Renaissance's influence on religion also takes a different path. In our history, the critiques of clerical corruption by humanists like Erasmus helped pave the way for the Protestant Reformation. In the Dual Monarchy, the king's power over the church is already immense. He controls the appointments of bishops and abbots in both England and France. The scholarly debate in this world would be whether the Reformation could ever happen here. The king, as the most Christian king of France and defender of the faith of England, has little incentive to break with Rome, as he already exercises immense control over the church in his lands, a situation known as Gallicanism in France. Instead of a reformation, you might see a state-controlled Catholic humanist reform movement. The Crown would use humanist scholars to clean up clerical abuses, reform monasteries, and improve the education of priests, but all within the existing Catholic framework. This would be a top-down reformation designed to strengthen the Church as an instrument of state power, not to challenge its theological foundations. The religious map of Europe would look very different. with a massive, unified and reformed Catholic bloc in the West, staunchly resisting the Protestant movements that might still arise in Germany and Switzerland. The spirit of the Renaissance, therefore, is not suppressed, but co-opted. It is channeled into avenues that serve the interests of the Anglo-French state. Its art becomes a reflection of royal power, its scholarship a tool of political legitimization, and its reformist zeal a mechanism for strengthening state control over religion. The vibrant, sometimes chaotic, and revolutionary energy of the Italian Renaissance is tamed and harnessed, giving the dual monarchy a magnificent cultural gloss, but one that reflects the sober, martial, and authoritarian nature of the regime that created it. In a world dominated by the solid, tangible reality of the dual monarchy, what happens to the idea of France? In our history, the crucible of the 100 Years' War, particularly the phase involving Joan of Arc, was instrumental in forging a unique French national identity, separate from and often in opposition to England. But in this timeline, that process is violently aborted. The independent French state is a historical phantom, a memory that grows fainter with each passing generation. The result is the haunting presence of a lost France, a cultural ghost that wanders through the corridors of the Anglo-French kingdom. This sense of a lost France would be most potent in the regions that had been the heartland of Valois resistance, the Languedoc, the Auvergne, the lands south of the Loire. Here, the English victory is not seen as a legitimate dynastic succession, but as a foreign conquest. The local nobility may have bent the knee, but their loyalty is thin. The peasantry, burdened by taxes to a distant Anglo-French king, would nurture a sullen, passive resistance. It is in these regions that the memory of the good kings of the Valois dynasty would be kept alive. The established historical fact is that oral culture, ballads, poems and folk tales, was the primary means of transmitting history and identity for the vast majority of the illiterate population. So, in the taverns of Toulouse and the villages of the Dordogne, songs would be sung in the local Occitan dialect, not about the great victories of Henry VI, but about the tragic exile of Charles VII and the bravery of the lords who fell fighting the English. This creates a cultural underground. While official histories written in Paris and London celebrate the unity of the two crowns, a counter-narrative flourishes in the south. This isn't an organised political movement. The English garrisons and the loyalist nobles are too powerful for that. It is, instead, a culture of nostalgia and quiet defiance. A quirky and poignant detail of this phenomenon would be the veneration of certain saints who were, in reality, Valois partisans. A local knight who was executed for resisting the English might, over generations of storytelling, become a martyr. His grave a site of unofficial pilgrimage, his story told as one of pious sacrifice for the true France. This folk Catholicism would be a constant irritant to the official church, which is controlled by the Anglo-French crown. This idea of a lost France would also become a potent political tool for the enemies of the dual monarchy. Whenever the kingdom is in conflict with, say, the Holy Roman Empire or the Spanish kingdoms, its rivals would undoubtedly try to weaponize this cultural grievance. They would fund the printing of pamphlets in French, reminding the people of their glorious, independent past. They might even find and support a distant descendant of the Valois line, a new pretender, and promote his claim as a way to destabilise the French territories of the dual monarchy. France, the ghost, becomes a pawn in the great game of European power politics. The scholarly debate in this alternate world would centre on a fascinating question. Was a unified French identity even a reality before the war? Some historians would argue that in the 14th century, a man from Gascony and a man from Flanders had little in common and would not have identified as French in a national sense. They would argue that the dual monarchy simply replaced one ruling dynasty with another, and that the modern idea of a French nation was never a historical inevitability. Other scholars would passionately disagree. They would point to the unifying role of the French language, the langue d'oil, the University of Paris, and the shared allegiance to the Capetian and Valois kings as clear evidence of a nascent national consciousness. For this group, the English victory was a profound tragedy that destroyed something real and organic, replacing it with an artificial and oppressive political construct. The legacy of this lost France would be a permanent fault line running through the dual monarchy. It would explain the Crown's need for a large and expensive army of occupation in its own French territories. It would fuel the deep-seated cultural anxiety and resentment that we explored in the southern regions. It would create a perpetual other within the kingdom itself, a source of instability that could be exploited by external foes or internal rebels. The Kingdom of England and France might be a single political entity on the map, but in the hearts and minds of many of its French-speaking subjects, it is a house divided, a home haunted by the memory of what it once was and what it might have been. The fleur-de-lis on the royal banner might represent a conquered territory to the English, but to some it will always be a tombstone. And so, we arrive at the great overarching question that hangs over this entire alternate history. Could it have lasted? We have built a superpower, a dual monarchy that dominates Europe, pioneers the age of discovery, and develops a unique hybrid culture. But is this magnificent two-headed beast ultimately stable? Or is it a political monstrosity, a creature whose own internal contradictions are destined to tear it apart? The long-term survival of the Anglo-French Union is far from certain, and the forces that could lead to its unravelling are woven into its very fabric. The first and most fundamental pressure point is the one we've touched upon before: the persistent, unerasable sense of separate identities. Generations may pass, a new Anglo-French aristocracy may fuse its bloodlines and its crests, but for the common man in Sussex or the peasant in the Auvergne, their worlds remain distinct. Language, customs, local loyalties, and a century of war-forged animosity cannot be erased by royal decree. The established historical fact that works against long-term unity is the sheer demographic imbalance. The population of France, even after the devastation of the war, was still several times larger than that of England. This means that for the Union to feel truly balanced, the English would always have to punch above their weight, maintaining control through military and administrative superiority rather than popular consent. This is a draining, expensive, and ultimately fragile way to rule. Any crisis that weakens the central authority of the crown could see these old identities re-emerge with a vengeance. Imagine a succession crisis. The Lancastrian dynasty, in our timeline, was plagued by instability and mental illness. What if a king like our Henry VI, gentle and pious, but mentally frail and prone to catatonia, were to rule this dual monarchy in his own right? A long, weak reign would be a disaster. Factions would form at court, not just based on personal ambition, but along national lines. An English party might coalesce around one potential heir, arguing for a renewed focus on the English realm, while a French party, likely led by the great French-speaking nobles and the Duke of Burgundy, might support a rival claimant who they feel better represents their interests. The Wars of the Roses, which in this timeline were suppressed by a strong crown, could reappear on a terrifyingly international scale. A civil war fought not just in the fields of England, but across the entire expanse of the dual monarchy. External pressures would also constantly probe for weakness. The rival powers of Europe, the Spanish kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire, would not remain passive forever. They would modernise their own armies and state structures, partly in response to the threat posed by the Anglo-French behemoth. A coalition of rival powers, perhaps funded by the vast silver wealth of a Spanish-controlled Americas, could one day be strong enough to challenge the dual monarchy directly. The most likely flashpoint for such a conflict would be the Burgundian lands. As we debated, the loyalty of the Duke of Burgundy is always suspect. A clever Holy Roman Emperor or Spanish king could entice the Duke to switch allegiances, promising him the royal crown he so desperately craves in exchange for his help in dismantling the Anglo-French kingdom. The defection of Burgundy would be the strategic equivalent of pulling the keystone from an arch. The entire structure could collapse. Then there is the pressure from within. We imagine the rise of a defensive, resentful English nationalism. What about its French counterpart? The culture of a lost France might not remain passive and folkloric forever. A charismatic leader, a new Joan of Arc, though perhaps a nobleman or a radical priest this time, could galvanise this latent sense of grievance into an open rebellion. In an age of religious turmoil, like the Reformation era, such a revolt could take on the fervour of a holy war, a fight to restore the true, Catholic, and independent Kingdom of France. A quirky but powerful catalyst for such a rebellion could be something as simple as a series of failed harvests or a new plague. When people are suffering, they look for someone to blame, and a distant English-speaking king and his foreign tax collectors make for an easy target. So, we circle back to our opening image, the English king being crowned in Notre Dame. A moment of ultimate triumph, but also one of profound hubris. Forging a kingdom with the sword is one thing, holding it together for centuries is another entirely. The dual monarchy, for all its power and glory, is an entity built on a contradiction. It demands that two peoples, two cultures, two histories become one. It is a political marriage born of a violent conquest, and like many such unions, it is haunted by the ghosts of the past and threatened by the irreconcilable differences of its partners. Perhaps in the end, the thread that holds the two crowns together would simply unravel under the immense strain. The great Anglo-French experiment would fail, collapsing into a renewed and even more bitter conflict, leaving the map of Europe once again broken, and a new, more potent and more modern nationalism to rise from its ashes. The two-headed crown, in the end, might find that it has two minds, each pulling in a different direction, until the whole magnificent creation simply tears itself apart. The dream of Henry V, a single pious kingdom stretching from the highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked plains of Gascony, was perhaps the most ambitious act of state-building in the entire medieval era. In our journey tonight, we saw that dream made real, forged in the mud and blood of Agincourt, codified in the ink of the Treaty of Troy, and cemented by the crushing of the last vestiges of Valois resistance. We watched it reshape the world, creating a new kind of nobility, a new form of culture, and a global empire that was born a century ahead of its time. But we also felt the deep, persistent tremors beneath this grand edifice, the echoes of a lost France, the quiet resentment of an England feeling itself culturally colonised by its own conquest, and the sheer grinding difficulty of holding two such ancient and proud identities together under a single crown. We are left with a sense of profound ambiguity. Was this union a glorious, if temporary, achievement that brought a century of war to a decisive end? Or was it an unnatural and ultimately unsustainable political monstrosity, a triumph that contained the seeds of its own destruction from the very moment of its inception? The truth is, history is not a straight line. It is a messy, tangled web of choices and consequences, of grand ambitions and human frailties. The world where the leopards and the lilies flew on the same banner is a world of breathtaking scope, but also one of deep, abiding melancholy. It reminds us that victory and loss are often two sides of the same coin, and that the past, even a past that never was, can cast a very long shadow indeed. It leaves us to ponder the nature of identity, the fragility of nations, and the strange, unpredictable currents that guide the long river of time.